Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com. And Dan Andriaco's No Police Like Holmes, the first of 9 Sebastian McCabe, Jeff Cody stories, now free on Amazon Kindle.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 156. The Complete Paget Portfolio.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, hello there once again, and welcome back to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees, where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And today we have a special treat in store for you. We will be talking to none other than Nick Utechin, who has edited the new book out from Wessex Press, The Complete Paget Portfolio. A little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll jump right into that interview with Nick. If you'd like to leave us a comment or give us any kind of feedback, you can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/ihose156. You can find us at I Hear of Sherlock on most of the major social networks, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And, of course, you can email us at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. And if you are of the speaking variety, why, we would welcome your call. You can dial the phone, you know, that thing on that flat piece of glass you have, that has numbers as well as letters, and you can actually type out our phone number, which is 774-221-7323. That's 774-221-READ, and leave us an audio comment. It's been a long time since we've actually gotten a voicemail from you, so well, spice things up for us. Let's see what we can make happen.
Yeah, go on. Yeah. You can do it.
That's right. Well, we were fortunate to run into Nick recently at the conference in Bloomington, Indiana, the Gillette to Brett 5 conference, and you heard us speak with him briefly during that episode. And, of course, that conference was hosted by our friends at Wessex Press. And, boy, do they have a thing or two to share with you.
In the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, every November 15, we mark the death of Albertus Magnus, the great philosopher and theologian in 1280. He described the ideals of friendship in his great work, De Bono. If only he had a college named after him. But you don't need to matriculate to get your degree in Sidney Paget. Not when you can own the complete Paget portfolio. Every Sherlock Holmes illustration by Sidney Paget, reproduced directly from the Strand Magazine, and the surviving original artwork, curated by Nick Utechin. This ultimate archive of the art that created the universal image of Sherlock Holmes is available right now at wessexpress.com. Over the river and through the woods trot fast my dapple gray, spring over the ground like a hunting hound on this Thanksgiving Day. Before your family gathers, reach for the pleasure only a volume from the Wessex Press can provide. Choose yours today.
Well, how prescient you were. Albertus Magnus. There's a Sherlockian connection there,
Oh, you're kidding.
Now, you mentioned the college, and, of course, a number of the early adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes actually attended Albertus Magnus.
Ah, yes. Those brave, strong, heady women whose presence still grace us today. God bless them all.
I know, but what a heck of a commute that was all the way from Wessex to New York City.
Well, it was worse than that because he was actually, I think, in Cologne. He was in Germany.
Oh, even more.
Or else he was wearing cologne. I don't remember. It was something about cologne.
Oh. Well, let's toddle over to this area here where it's bound to smell a little better as we speak to Nick. Well, we are delighted to welcome Nicholas Utechin, whom we will be calling Nick throughout the interview, back to the program. You may recall that Nick was with us all the way back. I think it was on episode 8 when we talked about keeping green the memory. That had to do with a book that he co-edited with Steve Rothman, all about our friend Richard Lancelyn Green. Now, if you don't remember Nick, he is a longtime member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. He joined all the way back in 1966. And, of course, he was invested not too long thereafter in the Baker Street Irregulars in 1975. And he has the longest running editorship with the Sherlock Holmes Journal. He spent 30 years with that fine publication, and just retired from it a few years ago. He also is a master Copper Beech smith. He was over here in the States recently, both for the Copper Beeches meeting, and you probably heard us talk to him briefly on, I think it was episode 153, as we recapped what went on at the From Gillette to Brett conference. He lives in Oxford in the UK with his wife, and he says he enjoys being surprised by the careers of their 2 sons and the antics of 2 grandchildren. Nick, welcome back.
Well, thank you very much. It's taken a long time, but I'm utterly delighted.
Well, it's completely worth the wait, I can assure you. So,
let us see what is going to follow.
Well, we'll see. We may come to a different conclusion after the show. Why don't we revisit, I feel like we've known this about you for some time, but some of our listeners who may have joined us after episode 8 may not know this. So why don't you tell us when and how you first came into contact with Sherlock Holmes?
I think any young boy will probably, as I was, be given a copy of the Sherlock Holmes stories at about the age of 12. My mother actually made a bad mistake and gave me a copy of The Hound of the Baskervilles for Christmas when I was 8. And it didn't work out. It really didn't. It was just a little bit too much for me. I won't say I was absolutely terrified, but it was too early. And then a sage great aunt of mine, when I was 11 or 12, so in, 1964, gave me the omnibus edition, the John Murray omnibus edition of the Sherlock Holmes short stories. And that got me. And then, crucially, the William Baring Gould biography, because in the English edition, which is rather different, as I'm sure you know and your listeners will know, from the American edition, carried a lot of information in the back. And there was the address of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. And I wrote to Lord Donegal, the then editor of the Sherlock Holmes Journal, and I was a member by the age of 14.
That's astounding. Were you the youngest member?
I certainly was at that time. Other people came in a little bit younger than me a bit later on, as would be the case. Most famously, Stephen Fry, the actor, the British actor, and I'm sure your listeners will know about Stephen. Stephen, I think, was 14, but he came along a bit later.
Wow. Well, they start them young over there in the homeland.
Oh, yeah. Well roasted early.
Now, briefly, you mentioned there was a difference between the UK edition and the US edition of the Baring Gould biography of Sherlock Holmes. What are some of the things that stand out to you as being different in those two editions?
Well, so I don't have them both in front of me, but I do recall, obviously, there was a far, far more interesting dust jacket on the English edition. There is it's William Gillette as Holmes in a sort of oval picture on the front with gold no, not gold, silver and blue sort of stuff all around on the dust jacket, whereas the American edition has. Do we know who that person was playing Sherlock, acting as Sherlock Holmes on the front cover? I don't know. And then, crucially, as I say, we also had illustrations in the English edition, which I don't think you did. And then, as I say, there were references, and there was mention at the back of other societies and the world of Sherlockiana that I didn't yet know existed.
And that point about illustrations, I think that leads perfectly into what we're here to discuss with you today. You are the editor of a rather impressive volume, one of the latest from Wessex Press, sponsors of our show here, the complete Paget portfolio, every Sherlock Holmes illustration by Sidney Paget, reproduced directly from the Strand Magazine, including the surviving original artwork. How did this project come about?
Well, as in the best ways of such projects, I had an idea. And the idea was that if I may, I'll go back to 1980 now. I went along to the famous auction in 1980 at Sotheby's in London when 3 original Sidney Pagets were up for sale. My wife Annie and I went into Sotheby's in London, and I'd seen what the potential prices were, what the auctioneers thought the prices might be, and back then they were saying a few £100 each, and I thought, well, God, even that was probably beyond me, and I went into the auction, and terrifyingly, I saw television lights. I saw bright lights, and I saw that this was going to be an occasion. And the reason was that these items were being put up by the Reverend John Paget, son of Sidney. And the 3 Pagets were, well, there was one from the 3 students. There was also the wash drawing, the head and shoulders, the unpublished one, the famous one that was allegedly thrown away into the waste paper basket. There was one from the Hound of the Baskervilles, and there was the famous one from the Second Stain, where he's ripping up the carpet and delving under the carpet to find what was going on under that. Anyway, sorry, I'm rambling on a little bit. However, I actually saw some 3 real original Sidney Pagets, and I thought, hey, we've got something special here, even though I knew the pictures from the Strand Magazine, etc., etc. Well, the trouble was that the initial bid started at about £1,000, and up and up and up they went. Nevertheless, actually, that one, I'm looking at the original catalogue now, the one from the 3 students, went for £950, £950. So whatever that was in dollars back in 1980, heavens alive, some of us might be able to afford that now.
Right.
Damn it, I couldn't then. And therefore, over the years, I sort of, and I think most British Sherlockians, or as we call them Holmesians, would fall in love, and the image of Holmes as created by Sidney Paget is the image that we have on this side of the Atlantic, as opposed to your Frederick Dorsteel one, whom I don't for one second say is a bad artist. Indeed, I need someone to come up with the remaining 4 copies that I'm missing of the Collier's magazines with his covers, but we'll leave that aside. In March 2015, I wrote an email to Steve Doyle, and I said, you know what no one has ever done? The ultimate coffee table book, the full Sidney Paget Sherlock Holmes picks, 1 by 1, page by glossy page, max 2 on a page. This is what I'm writing then. No tedious canonical text. That was the crucial thing. Brief chapter and verse, re each pick. Well, that didn't happen. No one has ever seen in one volume the full consecutive pictorial history uninterrupted. And I suppose, it was a long gestation period, but there we go.
Well, I think it was worth waiting for.
Well, I'm very glad to hear you say that. I suppose the idea is that do you know how many illustrations Sidney Paget did for the Sherlock Holmes stories? I'll tell you, it's 356.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You stole my answer.
Hey! And therefore, you tend to forget that he did, I can't now remember off the top of my head, 60 or 80 just for the Hound of the Baskervilles. And these are forgotten illustrations. To be realistic, you're reading the story, and unless you have got one of those reproduction Strand Magazine volumes which have appeared over the years, and of course the illustrations are very dark and murky and black and small, you actually don't remember what they were, and that one and that one and that one.
And the details,
of course, over the years one remembers the famous Sidney Pagets, but there's a lot that, were work-a-day, to be perfectly honest, stuff. And we thought, and I'm glad that Wessex Press were on board for this, well, let's just have a go. Let's do every single one in order of publication, with a tiny bit of text by me, and see how it goes.
I once was commissioned to write a quiz for the Speckled Band. The annual meeting, there is a quiz every year. I had gotten so proficient at the quiz, they had to change the rules. So participants were only eligible to win every other year, rather than every year. So they said, well, Mr. Smarty Pants, why don't you write some of the quizzes on your off years? And I wrote one that was a visual quiz, and I put in some fairly good, copies of the reproductions, and quizzed people on, what the caption was, what story it was from, who the characters were, etc. And do you know that was probably one of the least participated in or least least well done quizzes of them all. And I think it's your point.
In a sense, of course, what you're saying is that it proves my point.
Yes.
I mean, we all know the famous illustration, Speckled Band striking out at the bell rep, anything from The Final Problem, pictures of Sebastian Moran in the empty house, etc., etc., etc. But there was so much more, and I also became more and more interested in the sheer workload, the sheer fact of how Paget went about his business, and the crucial point, which maybe there is time for us to talk about, in that what people reading their copy of the Strand Magazine back then didn't see what Sidney Paget had drawn. They saw engravings. They saw that, and some of them are not very good engravings, because that is the process. The Strand Magazine and Titbits and all those journals did not reproduce the artwork photographically, as one would suggest. It was engravings, and therefore Paget had to work and work and work, and he did his paintings in wash and black ink and paint, light black paint, and then they had to be whooshed off to the art editor, Boot, of the Strand Magazine, who then had to farm them out to engravers. And anyway, to cut a long story short, this was an opportunity with this book, perhaps for people to see what those pictures really looked like, because I'm delighted to say that Steve Doyle and Mark Gagan scanned every single illustration direct from a page of the Strand Magazine. They didn't do copies from copies, and then they worked on many of the illustrations to heighten them. And I believe that in some cases, you're actually seeing a better. Well, I wouldn't I? You're seeing a better version than the readers in the Strand did originally 100 years ago.
It's fascinating, and you've just covered, Nick, a number of things that I want to get back to. Oh, no, not at all. But let's zero in for a moment on the engraving
process was because Paget.
Don't expect me to get too technical.
No, not at all. Well, now here's a question.
Okay.
Are there any of the engraving plates that have survived, or were they all melted down and reused?
That is a very good question to which I have absolutely no answer whatsoever. That was not part of my research, and I have never even thought about that until this very second when you've just asked me. So,
I would no, not at all. Well, I would imagine, because they did reuse the plates because they printed the original strands and then they printed the collected books, so Nunes was very busy in the printing side, and I'm sure the typical process there, I think, was just to reuse all that metal. But that aside, Paget died relatively young, not yet 50. Was
tragic, 48, yes.
Was any of his work photographically reproduced, or was it all done by engraving, and was it all steel point engraving, or don't we know?
It was all steel point engraving, so far as I know. I have never come across any photographically reproduced direct artwork of his.
No, so he was before the photographic engraving process.
Well, of course, what's ridiculous is that photographs appeared in the Strand magazine, but not of the illustrations to Sherlock or any of the other stories which were being illustrated there.
Well, and that's because the end result of printing from an engraving is, as you've pointed out in this wonderful book, sharper and more interesting, and you have much more control over the lights and the darks. But just review for our listeners who might not be familiar at a high level, the high level process. Let's start with a story. Is there anything in your research that has turned up how the particular scenes were chosen? You mentioned all of these Hound of the Baskervilles illustrations. Did somebody just say, Paget, here's the text, have fun, or were these scenes
so far as I know, it is exactly that. We know that Paget, the whole thing seemed a rushed job. Paget was already an established artist. His work had already appeared in various publications. And as we all know, allegedly, the letter went from Boot, the art editor of the Strand, to Mr. Paget, addressed allegedly to Walter Paget. I happen to know that at least one scholar is querying this famous story that in the end it was Sidney Paget who got the deal because they approached Walter Paget first. This person believes that in fact it was always going to be Sidney Paget, but we'll leave that aside, and that's for another day. He'd already been working for things like the Sphere and Pictorial World. He was a very well-trained artist, but he was sent by Boot the injunction to illustrate these things. We know from his diary that Doyle's diary, I haven't got the dates directly in front of me, but he had about April. He had about 6 weeks basically to do the first 10 illustrations for Scandal in Bohemia, the first short story. So far as we know, he was given no help at all. No indications at all. Because Doyle, he will have written the story, and Greenhow Smith, the editor of the Strand Magazine, had the story, but we have no knowledge at all that the Strand Magazine people said, I want you to do that and that and that. So, for example, it's up to, and it's fairly sensible, that Paget does a couple, a solo picture of the Count Fonan to Thingamajig in the Scandal of Bohemia. Give me his name.
Oh, yeah, the King of Bohemia.
Count Von Kramm.
Absolutely. So it was, as far as I can understand it, and the same through all the stories, he will just have decided, yes, obviously we need to have a picture of the King of Bohemia. I'll do a picture of the King of Bohemia. And so it went on and on and on and on. And occasionally, then of course later on, there were some really dodgy and rather stupid things. And this is more Strand Magazine rather than Paget. But if, for example, you happen to have by your side the edition of the Strand which has the final problem in it, the opening illustration of the final problem.
Spoiler alert.
Is yeah, okay, I'll stop.
No, go ahead.
No. That's what
you know exactly what I'm saying.
Right.
We've got Moriarty. We've got that most famous of illustrations of Holmes and Moriarty fighting above the Reichenbach Falls and Moriarty's hand up in the air, etc., etc., etc. And I think it actually says "The Death of Sherlock Holmes" is the caption.
Yeah, it was a spoiler. I mean,
a complete spoiler. Lovely picture, iconic picture. But if I was Doyle, and we know from other events later on, he tried to get in touch on other events, including things like the tragedy of the Korosko, and said, "Don't do this. Don't mess around. Don't spoil."
Well, or from the editor's standpoint, Greenough Smith could have decided to put that plate at the conclusion of the story rather than as the frontispiece. That's a judgment that he made as well.
Yeah, and it was a crap judgment.
Now let's go back. Let's go back to the process a little bit. So just for our listeners who might not know what's involved. So theoretically, I'm Sidney Paget, and I get this manuscript, and I read through it a couple of times, and I say to myself, oh, this is a good bit, and that's a good bit. And as near as we know, Paget never cranked out 10 illustrations, but only 6 were used. As far as we know, everything he produced, he was either told, give me 6, give me 4, or his judgment was so good that everything he produced was eventually used. So his art arrives at Nuna's office, at the offices of the Strand, and they turn it over to the engraver. And the engraver, through some
different engravers, don't forget it, different engravers.
Right. And there are companies that just do engravings of art for the magazine industry in Britain at the time. And
absolutely.
It pops over to me, I'm the engraver, and there I am looking at this watercolor, this wash, this illustration. And now I must essentially make a reverse copy of it on a metal plate that could then stand up to the impressions of ink and paper. And I do that, either the amazing work, clearly there was some sort of photographic process used by the engraver, because the alignment between, it's not just my very best effort based on my eye, the alignment between the original artwork and the final engraving is very, very precise relatively.
Oh, indeed, and this is an area which, quite extraordinarily, of course, has almost disappeared now. So we are really looking at a very historical way of doing things, and indeed the only way they could do things in those days. And this is why it is intriguing that we have a variety, 2 or 3 different companies. You have to look for the little signatures, which are not always there, but almost always there, at the bottom right, bottom left, wherever it is, of the engravings, and you'll see a name like Naumann or whatever. And you have, and I don't know the technicalities, I really don't, and there are others who have published on this who are better at this end of things than I am. But some of them, they do it more clearly. And others do it more, it seems to be more smudgily. I don't think it was always necessarily in the latter case, just because of the way it was reproduced on the pages of the Strand. But maybe, not errors, but I don't know, maybe they didn't care. Maybe they were rushing a little bit. Maybe there was a quick turnaround required. But it is instructive to see, and I hope in some cases one can look at the illustrations in this book, the complete Paget portfolio, and begin to guess. Oh, I think that's Naumann, or I think that's one of the others, and this is how it goes. And he's better at doing that than this other guy.
Yeah, and in your book, in the text, you occasionally point out where the engraver has cleverly signed his name below the SP
of Sidney
Indeed.
Paget, and you can make it out. And so the engraver would work basically on the plate with the steel point to do this. And then he finishes his work, and then the artwork is packed up again and sent back to the offices of the Strand, and then presumably some of it goes back to Sidney Paget, but it's really scattered all over the world eventually.
You see, you're being very instructive in this interview, if I may say so. I did not go through that reverse process. I have no idea whether it actually went back to Sidney Paget. Sidney Paget was, he was being paid X guineas per picture, and as far as I know, once it went off to Boot to go on to the engravers, that was as far as it went, so far as Paget was concerned. Would Paget be called in on? It's like the writer of a movie. Once the director has started making a movie, does he go back to the writer to check things? Very often not. I don't think Paget had any part in it thereafter, after he'd provided the original pictures.
Well, of course, the challenge for artists, for illustrators, and we've seen this in Freddie Steele, too, in the States, is you can't possibly get back all of your work. There's just no place to store it, particularly if you're Sidney Paget and do 350 illustrations. And clearly, some wound up with Conan Doyle, because in your book you point out Conan Doyle presented one particular image to this one or that one. And clearly some wound up with Paget's family, because the Reverend Mr. Paget would not have been bringing them to auction.
Yes, but even more critically, and this may be part of the material that did not actually fight its way into my final book, is that the Strand Magazine themselves retained a very large number of the illustrations, the originals, and they were available for sale to members of the public. At one guinea, that is 21 shillings a time, and I think I think we reproduce that anyway. It's all mentioned, and it's absolutely staggering. You could walk in, and if you had 5 guineas on you, you could have bought 5 Sidney Paget originals.
Yes,
that's why they get so disseminated and all over the place. There was also a fire. We know this for a fact. There was a fire at one stage at the Strand Magazine offices, and we know that a number of the Sidney Paget Sherlock Holmes illustrations went up in flame.
Oh, that's too bad.
Oh, really?
That's too bad.
So we don't know what's missing, though, do we? Because you've said rather authoritatively there are 356, so that means were there more?
We know.
That's how many were drawn.
As we know we've got 23 in the world that we know of. But it is not impossible that somewhere up mouldering in an attic somewhere is one of the many missing Pagets. But with the best will in the world, in this week or 2 weeks that we know that a new Beaton's Christmas Annual 1887 has just turned up, about which I don't know the provenance, but magic happens.
Right.
Well, so let's turn the process around. So 356, 23 originals presumably exist. Was it a challenge then, once the concept of the book is agreed upon, to go out and actually find who's got what Paget?
Well, of course. I mean, we will all know, or dedicated listeners to IHOSE. Do you call it IHOS or IH? Anyway,
oh yeah. We go with the Apple-friendly iHose. We're good like that.
Dedicated listeners to the Apple-friendly iHose will know that you basically, in matters like this, have to turn to Randall Stock. And Randall, of course, has got on his wonderful, wonderful website a listing, etc., of the known places of the known Sidney Paget originals. So that wasn't actually difficult, obviously, to identify. And so you have a mixture of personal owners and you have institutional owners. And I did the sort of initial writing of letters to people, or sending of emails. and then on a couple of occasions, one needed to bring in Wessex Press because there might have been a fee involved, and I wasn't going to go down that path for reproduction purposes. And I have to say that, well, I will say it, all bar one of the owners were extremely happy to go forward with this project and provided very good images. In two cases, I think it's two, certainly one if not two, I actually still don't know who is the person who owns that original. We obtained good images from two people via circuitous routes, which leave me in the dark, but it worked out for us. But we have 22 of the 23.
Well, that's wonderful. And I happen to know who the uncooperative party was, and let's just say it was not a surprise. And we'll leave that there. Now,
hanging in the air.
Yes. Had you physically seen any of these originals outside of that 1980s Sotheby's auction in the years between?
Never, not once. Sorry, no, what am I talking about? Yes, I had, because I'm glad to claim Glenn Moranka as a very good friend. Yes, I have been to Glenn's house in San Francisco, and yes, I have seen on his walls 7 Sidney Paget originals.
That's amazing.
Well, this is known. I'm sure that, he's not going to make a fuss about me saying this. And Glenn was the most immediately helpful. And Glenn being Glenn, he had already taken wonderful photographs, including of the rear covers, right, the rear sides of illustrations, which was also, I think we reproduced at least one, which is also extremely interesting to see the various scrawls on the back, including, I think, one referring to Mr. Boot, etc. So, yes, sorry, I had seen, of course, those ones. And I'm lucky enough, but it's slightly peripheral, I'm lucky enough to own an original Sidney Paget myself. But, of course, it is not a Sherlock Holmes Sidney Paget. It is a tragedy of the Korosko Sidney Paget, one of only 2 known still to exist. So I'm rather pleased that I have sort of, if you're going to do a list, it was published in the Strand Magazine. It was written by Arthur Conan Doyle, and it's a Sidney Paget illustration. Yeah. And in fact, the picture I do have, the 2 people in the foreground look so like Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, you wouldn't believe.
We've been telling you now for some time about Dan Andriaco's Sebastian McCabe, Jeff Cody mystery series. Each one of these traditional whodunits is really packed with a whole basket full of Sherlockian Easter eggs. And, if you haven't gotten around to sampling the series yet, we've got the perfect opportunity for you now, because No Police Like Holmes, which is the first of the 9 books in the McCabe Cody series, No Police Like Holmes is now free on Amazon Kindle. You just go to Amazon, search for No Police Like Holmes, and download the novel at no charge. This very first story involves a Sherlock Holmes colloquium on a college campus. There's a theft and a murder that, pretty much ruin the conference, as thefts and murders do in conference situations. And then college public relations director Jeff Cody gets involved, and he's knee-deep in Sherlockian suspects. And he's besieged by an aggressive reporter that he loves but no longer dates, so a nice little conflict there. And he's competing with Sebastian McCabe to try and solve the crimes first. It worsens when Jeff and his ex-girlfriend Linda Teal find themselves under the suspicion of murder. And for good reason. They actually are hiding something. What is it? Well, you'll have to download No Police Like Holmes and take a look at this satirical romp that doesn't take Sherlockians seriously, but does take Sherlock Holmes seriously. Check it out now No Police Like Holmes, free on Kindle. Now, you also have some other things that belong to Paget, if I'm not mistaken, things that, would have been around his studio or that he carried with him on a daily basis that became inspirations for some of the objects that he included in the drawings.
Well,
you want to talk about those?
Well, I'm very happy to, and that came out of the 1980 Sotheby's sale. I was extremely downhearted that the original Pagets, the three original drawings, and the Head and Shoulders unpublished were going to be beyond my means. And I have to say that actually I wasn't yet married to Annie, but my wife was with me, and she said, "Oh, for crumb's sake, buy something." and well, lot number, I've got the catalogue here, if you give me a second, lot number, oh God, I can't find it immediately. Anyway, there was Sidney Paget's magnifying glass and Sidney Paget's riding crop. And I bid for those, and I got those. And as far as I know, on that famous Sotheby's date, I was the only private purchaser. All the others were dealers. They may have been working on behalf of others, but I was the only sort of ordinary person off the street who made a purchase. And I wrote afterwards to the Reverend John Paget, and I said, "Look, blah, 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 I'm the person who bought the magnifying glass and the riding crop. I wonder if you'd be kind enough to send me a piece of paper sort of giving me provenance and just blah, blah, blah." And it was the most wonderful letter I ever had. I don't have it in front of me. He wrote me a covering letter saying, yes, of course, I'm delighted they found a home. And then he wrote... It was on it's on a piece of an exercise, a page from an exercise book, a lined child's exercise book, as it were. And he wrote at the top of it, "This is a page from my father, Sidney Paget's, exercise book. I am delighted to say," and then he wrote 3 lines about the magnifying glass, and then he drew a line under that, and then he wrote a separate thing, and he signed the bottom of that excerpt, and then he wrote a separate thing about the riding crop, and signed it at the bottom. And he sweetly in this covering letter said, "I have written it and laid it out in this way, just in case you ever wanted to mount them and have them separately. So you could cut this piece of paper of my father's exercise book and have one label under one and one label under the other." And I thought, my goodness me, what a... he was carrying history forward, and I was so delighted to have that.
Yeah.
And we reproduce in the Paget portfolio book. We reproduce the magnifying glass and the riding crop. I remember you mentioned at the very beginning. This may be edited, I don't know. But Richard Lancelin Green, the great collector, of course, was always extremely interested in how I was getting on with the magnifying glass and how I was getting on with the riding crop. And he was asking, every now and then he would ask, oh, you've still got them, have you? Have you still got them? Have you still? Anyway, I fought off his advances.
That's funny. Now, of course, the riding crop made its appearance very clearly in the right hand of Grimsby Roylott when he burst his way into the Baker Street flat. And, of course, Holmes himself used a riding crop very famously in the 6 Napoleons at the conclusion there. So wonderful to have that just tied so directly to Paget's work in the book here.
Well, we've got to be slightly realistic about it. I mean, okay, so this happened to be Sidney Paget's magnifying glass, and it happened to be Sidney Paget's riding crop. He was indeed, he was a proper hunter. He went hunting with hounds, and had a bad injury once, actually falling off a horse. I mean, it's delightful to say that this is Sherlock Holmes's magnifying glass and Sherlock Holmes's riding crop, but or Grimesby Roylott's, but we can take it only sort of so far in a sense, but it's as close as possible. And in the note about the magnifying glass, Paget said, "My mother always used to refer to it as the Sherlock Holmes glass." And that's in handwriting from John Paget. It delights one still all these years on.
Oh, that's wonderful. Love that.
Well, for those of our listeners who might not have tumbled to this, I mean, not to insult their intelligence, but generally, what you get here by studying these illustrations is, as we've just discussed, a great sense of the objects that were in Sidney Paget's possession, because when you as Paget sit down and say, I believe I'm going to illustrate this particular scene where Holmes is reclining on the couch and looking at a bowler cap, what you do is you then assemble your couch and you go and get your brother and you put him in a dressing gown and you say, lay here and lay there, and he becomes the model, and you basically sketch it from life. So this is one of the reasons why Walter Paget is so important to us.
It is extremely interesting. As I say, there are beginning to be doubts as to whether this whole famous story is actually accurate. I think this person who is about to publish something, but I won't reveal yet because it's not fair, but the whole Walter Sidney Paget story would appear to be based entirely on one piece that Winifred Paget, Sidney Paget's daughter, sister of the Reverend John Paget, whom I've been discussing, one interview that she gives saying that he, Walter, was the one that it was aimed at and he ended up being the model, etc. So, we'll sit back and see how that might play. But yes, I mean, the way it turns out, if he did indeed use Walter as a model, then that is exactly, he's got that sort of wickerwork chair which appears in a number of illustrations. There's the same sort of armchair with nice polished wooden armrests that appears in a number of illustrations. So yes, I mean, I suppose any professional illustrator would use what was to hand, and he was a very clever illustrator, as we know. In some cases, it's very bare. It's just a couple of, it's Holmes and Watson sitting on two chairs, whatever. There's no background. The very first illustration of all in a Scandal Behaviour is a vital illustration because it has an awful lot. It's got the fireplace, it's got the mantelpiece, it's got Watson sitting in an armchair, it's got Holmes standing in front of a roaring fire, and that is a quintessential thing, which I guess is Paget's own idea, that straight away he's got to the heart of it. We all love Sherlock Holmes. We don't love it for just the whodunits or who murdered who or what happened. It's that 221B half, the warmth. You come in there at the beginning of the story and Doyle puts you at ease, and then something suddenly happens. And Paget, with that one illustration, set the tone.
This touches on something I wanted to mention back when we were talking about the disposition of the originals, because let's face it, like Conan Doyle, who in the early years did not retain the manuscripts. Later on, we know that he did and had them bound and whatnot. So Paget was basically working from memory. Every time he recreated a Baker Street scene, he was remarkably consistent over the years. And, some of it is because the scenes were sparse and bare, so there wasn't as much to remember. But as you say, if he used his natural surroundings as the inspiration, if he had, that wicker chair, if he had a Moroccan table, et cetera, et cetera.
On the other hand, if you actually do go through these illustrations, if you really want to be what we over here call a nerd, N-E-R-D, i.e. a sort of a really boring person, if you want to have a look, you'll see, I think, that the door has hinges on both sides, and you'll certainly see that sometimes a cupboard or a desk is not exactly where it was in another illustration in another story. Now, of course, Mrs. Hudson may have moved things around. I doubt it, if Holmes would have permitted her. But I think Paget every now and then was just as forgetful as this man Arthur Conan Doyle was.
I don't know, Nick. I could picture Mrs. Hudson playing a practical joke and switching the hinges on the door every now and again.
I like it. Yes, no, indeed. There's room for a whole pastiche. There's room for a whole pastiche there. Yeah,
that's not a bad idea. Maybe Mrs. Hudson's kitchen, Bert.
That's right, Mrs. Hudson's kitchen. The lovely thing about this is that what you've produced here in the complete Paget portfolio is really nothing less than the complete photography album, Watson's complete photography album of virtually all of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, with the exception, of course, of Sign of Four and Study in Scarlet, which Paget did not illustrate.
And the casebook.
Yes, and the casebook, because he passed, sadly.
Yeah.
So you have really the record of everything, and it's worth a lot of study and attention. For example, one of the things you will discover that may surprise you as you look through all these illustrations is that Holmes never wore, at least in the world of Sidney Paget, an Inverness cape. He wore a caped back ulster and a hooded cloak, but he never wore a traditionally cut British or Scottish Inverness. So there.
Well, no, indeed. And of course, as we very famously know, it was Sidney Paget who decided that the cloth cap, what's it called, ear-flapped cap, was a deerstalker.
Yeah.
Ear-flapped travelling cap was a deerstalker. And he himself, just like, William Gillette with the pipe, he, Paget, created the iconic thing of the deerstalker. I think we ought to, if you've got time, Sidney Paget was not a brilliant artist. There are some of these Pagets, some of these illustrations that, the variety of the appearance of Sherlock Holmes himself is extraordinary. One of the most famous illustrations is from the Naval Treaty, and we've got Holmes with the moss rose. Yeah.
Yes.
He is standing there and looking at the rose. He is really ugly in that picture.
That is true.
In many other pictures, I can't. Just look at. He is a handsome man. So again, we've got a working artist who cares, I'm sure, but he wants to, he's got to turn things around. Just look once more and twice and three times at that Naval Treaty picture. Holmes is as ugly as sin.
Well, let's hope it wasn't Brother Walter then, or Uncle Walter.
Well, indeed.
Well, but to be a little bit fair to Paget, but no, you're absolutely right. It's not clear, since we have so relatively few of the originals, to what degree it might be execution on the part of the illustrator.
The engravers.
Versus the engravers.
And this is, of course, why it is so gratifying that Steve and Mark at Wessex Press have been able to reproduce, in the case of the 22 originals that we have, and readers can have a direct comparison. I mean, you'll never get anything better between what people read in the Strand, saw in the Strand, and what left Sidney Paget's pen. And that is the ultimate, that's the core of this book, to be perfectly honest. It is so wonderful who am I to say? But it's the first time it's been done, and everyone, bar one, have been extremely happy to help with this. And you see the quality of Paget's illustrating abilities when you are lucky enough to see the originals. And then, there are some that are fairly straightforward, as I say, in The Hound of the Baskervilles, somebody's rushing across a moor or whatever, blah, 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 without Holmes or Watson. So it's workaday illustrations. But I think, it is a portfolio. It's not been done before. It's all there, and readers can decide. Okay, actually, Paget did have something pretty good going for him, or they could in the end say, actually, God, that Frederick Dorr Steele, he was far better.
Now, just to kind of concluding, talking about these images here, you mentioned seeing the originals, certainly in Glenn's home, but also seeing them formatted here in the book. What were some of the big surprises that stood out to you as you looked at these 22 originals and compared them to the engravings? Were there things that you had never noticed before, or were there intricacies that stood out to you in particular?
Well, the absolutely crucial thing, so far as I'm concerned, and I'm no artist, I can draw, I can't draw for anything. It's his use of white. So Paget has drawn. Look at some cuffs, sleeve cuffs. Look at some collars. Look at the highlighting on the originals and the way that it works. Hold that original back on the page of my book, and hold it back about a 2 foot or a foot, and just see how clever. Because he was an artist, he was a professional, he knew exactly what was what, how he highlights and how it works. Some of them, less so. I was surprised to see that in one or two of them, yes, the Holmes figure was as flat as he appeared in the engraving. But, I can't repeat enough, and I've already done it too much. Paget was under pressure, I believe. He was turning them out. I don't know, how quickly could you draw something like that? They're all 8 inches by 7 inches or 8 by 10 inches or whatever. There's a lot of detail. It's going to go into a major publication. He is dealing with one, by the later years, he knew perfectly well that he was creating an image. He must have realized that, creating an image that was already famous and going to go down in posterity. Conan Doyle gave him that famous cigarette case on Sidney Paget's wedding, and it's from Sherlock Holmes. Heavens alive. He was a master artist. But I would look at the whites.
That's wonderful. Well, the book, The Complete Paget Portfolio, is available on wessexpress.com. It is $46.95, and we highly recommend it.
What can I say? You're very kind. I highly recommend it.
Well, it's a once in a lifetime thing. I mean, everyone who first encounters the stories and first sees the Strand becomes captivated, as you are with the character, with these little insights, these windows into life in Baker Street. And so having it all in one place, particularly of such quality, is really gratifying, at least this particular enthusiast.
They did a very good job, from my original idea. There is some more information. I think I mentioned earlier. There is some more information that didn't fight its way into the book, and there may be a way that I'll be able to make that information available to people who have already bought it. I don't want to be sort of silly about it, but there might be just a little bit more text.
Oh, good. Well, we can always download that. Say, there is one other question I would like to ask you just before we let you go, and I suppose it's worth mentioning. This calls to mind the fact that with the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, you have produced a lovely collection of the illustrations of the John Murray editions of the Canon. And for those of our listeners who haven't seen this, the gist is that as the adventures and the casebook and memoirs and so on came out over the years, individual illustrators were retained to do cover art for the dust jackets. And Nick, a couple of years ago, produced a lovely
collection of these. And I just didn't suddenly connect to that in my mind and realized that your interest in the physical presentation of Sherlock Holmes is really rather deep, beyond even the Pagets.
And, well, indeed, and those John Murray cover artists were the cover artists for my generation. You know, I'm 66 now, but these were the ones that were going when I became interested in Sherlock Holmes. I would go into the famous bookshop here in Oxford, Blackwell's, when I was a kid, and there they were, and these pictures were absolutely crucial. I could say that there might be possibly an expanded new edition of that coming from the Sherlock Holmes Society of London in the not too distant future, because I found one or two more pictures to add to that collection.
Oh, brilliant. Now, is any of that original art extant?
Not that I know of. We know that one of them, I can't remember which, it was shown at the 1951 Sherlock Holmes exhibition in London in Baker Street as part of the Festival of Britain. It's there in the catalogue. I can't off the top of my head remember which of the cover artists and which picture it was. There is a John Murray archive, because John Murray as a publisher has disappeared, but there is a Murray archive at Edinburgh University. And in the preparation of that book, I got in touch with them, and there's an awful lot that has not been catalogued. So, you know, I haven't followed that one through. There could be, who knows, stuff up there. Gosh, you've given me a new idea.
Good.
Speaking of other projects, what are you currently engaged in, Nick, that we can see hopefully sometime soon?
Well, those of you who subscribe to the Baker Street Journal will know that you get a free Christmas annual as part of your subscription. And I have to say that this coming Christmas, in a few weeks' time, the Baker Street Christmas Annual is co-written, and I will have to put this in the correct order. The great Scandinavian writer Matthias Bostrom asked me to join him in writing a sort of a two-parter. It's about the 1951 Sherlock Holmes exhibition, Festival of Britain, as I've just mentioned, and the much less known about 1952 exhibition that Adrian Conan Doyle took over to New York and completely messed up. So I think we have the full history of that in the Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual. Sadly, only available to those who subscribe. I'm lucky enough, another project that Wessex Press took on some time ago, and I'm hoping that will see the light of day quite soon, is there was a science society of the Sherlock Holmes Society over here, the only science society that ever was on this side of the Atlantic, called the Milvertonians of Hampstead. And the Milvertonians of Hampstead existed from the very late 50s to the very early 60s. And it is, as far as I know, the only society, Sherlockian society, that has ever existed that concentrates on one story, and that's it. I've written a history of that society, and we reproduce its publications and Christmas cards and things, and that should be out in the not too distant future.
Now that sounds like it was in your era, your coming of age in the Holmesian world. Were you a member?
You're very kind. You're very kind. I was still a tiny bit younger. Right. I think in 1958, when the Milvertonians started, I was only 6.
Okay. Well, you never know. Yeah, corresponding member and all that.
And how old are you?
Decidedly not 66.
Yeah. But don't worry, you will be.
Yes, well, God willing. That's fascinating, though. The history of society. I think we've seen various societies try their hand at this. The Norwegian explorers, I know, had a kind of a retrospective in one of their anniversary years. The Amateur Mendicant Society here in Detroit came up with its own publication that Chris Music edited. So lovely to see this and to understand the content.
What I'm happy about this publication is that it is an entirely forgotten society. It flared up like a comet and then fizzled out. But it made an imprint. It has its own, as I say, unique appeal as being the only society, so far as I know, that was dedicated just to one story. But it did publish and it did do other things. And I think also it may well be that some of your American listeners will actually never have heard of the Milvertonians of Hampstead.
That's right. That's right. And new to me as well. So, and for those of you who haven't been able to back your way into which story that refers to, that of course is Charles Augustus Milverton. Well, that's fascinating, Nick. Best of luck on those projects, and we will look forward to talking more about them, both here and over on our sister podcast, Trifles, as we continue to roll through the calendar year.
You're very kind, and it's been a privilege to talk to you. And I hope that those who can afford $46.95 will. Well, anyway, it was the end. It was a 3-year gestation, and it was a sort of an idea and a dream I had, and I hope and I believe that people will enjoy it.
Well, it is well worth it. It is just wonderfully produced. It's large format. It's about 8.5 by 10. Let's see here. It is exactly 274 pages, and it is just it's a pure treat. For anyone who has marveled at the Paget illustrations over the course of their Sherlockian careers, their Sherlockian interest, we've been waiting for this. So thank you. Thank you.
You're kind.
We spent approximately, 148 episodes in between having Nick on the show. Let's not do that again.
No, it's great. And Nick is just, I'm stumbling around trying to find the right words. I mean, he's contributed so much. He keeps contributing so much. His perspective is so interesting. His work is so interesting. And for those of us who love illustration, obviously the Pagets, the John Murray cover illustrations are so great. But he's also part of that community in London and in England, including Roger Johnson and Gene Upton and Guy Marriott and many, many others who also have a lot to say. So I think what we need to do is go over there and do, a couple of weeks of recording.
Hey, I'd be up for that. Maybe we can find a travel sponsor that'll cover our expenses, and we can do an iHose show on the road.
Oh, that's a great idea. I mean, Richard Branson, his 1 hour of his tea budget doesn't even come close to being 2% of what it would cost to send us to England.
There you go. Well, it is time for a couple of things. One, a little bit of news housekeeping. Sherlockian items in the news of late. I know there is an exhibition closing in there in the Northeast. Is it New Jersey specifically?
It is. It is at the Liberty Science Center, which is a wonderful location in Jersey City. It's right by the Liberty Marina and within viewing distance of the Statue of Liberty. And, of course, the exciting western shore of Manhattan. And it's a great trip, and I'm looking forward to an upcoming visit there because the International Sherlock Holmes exhibition has just opened and will be running at the Liberty Science Center, which is very convenient to get to. There's a small tram, a small mini line railroad that will go there directly, and lots of other ways to get there. And really looking forward to seeing that because it's been literally all over the world.
It has. It's a little inconvenient for me to get to that location. I did happen to attend the one in, I believe it was Columbus, about 2 or 3 years ago, and really enjoyed it. It was really well done, well thought out. Actual artifacts there, as well as a lot of interactive elements for the kids, as well as a mystery for every attendee to solve. So I think you'll enjoy yourself.
Yeah, that is the great part there, that there's a good focus on Conan Doyle, on the literary aspects of Sherlock Holmes, and all these involving things and mysteries to solve and ways to engage kids, which is what we really want to do, what the Beacon Society does and what we like to do, which is engage the next generation in the joy of Sherlock Holmes.
Absolutely. It's you're never too young to get on board. Well, even though Nick said he was too young to read The Hound of the Baskervilles, you're never too young to get involved in mystery solving and detection in general.
By the way, that's a very good point. Nick pointed out that his first introduction to Sherlock Holmes was in Baring Gould's biography of Holmes. And he sent me back to my bookshelves because I remember reading that biography, and I don't think I've looked at it, certainly in decades. And it turns out that I also have the British edition, which I acquired at some secondhand bookstore when I was in college or high school. And I've started reading it again, and it really is enjoyable. So if you have not taken a look at Baring Gould's biography of Sherlock Holmes, it's because what he does there is he obviously writes a biography, but he really tells the story of Holmes, including life adventures, major milestones, but also the cases as they would occur chronologically. And it's a lovely perspective on the canon.
That is. It absolutely is. And that was one of my first exposures as well. I used it as a resource in a research paper that I was writing in the 10th grade, I believe, which is what led me into the Men on the Tour, meeting with Teddy Niver, down at Gillette Castle. And speaking of Baring Gould, Tyke eventually sent to me William Baring Gould's tie from the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. So, I don't
with
have
his
it.
genuine soup stains on it, eh?
Yeah, there's splashes of mutton grease and steak and kidney pie and whatnot. It's very authentic. So I don't have the UK edition of the Baring Gould biography of Sherlock Holmes, but I do have the UK edition of Baring Gould's tie. So there's that.
Oh, that's really funny. Well, every time I go to a Sherlockian meeting, and I'm looking forward to doing this in January again, of course, when you could also go to the Liberty Science Center and see the exhibition if there's time, I always like to wear my socks, which used to belong to Christopher Morley. So.
Oh, how about that?
But, all the times I've worn them, nobody's remarked on them. I can't figure out why.
Well, maybe you have to hike your pant legs up a little bit.
Well, that would be rude.
Well, I'll go you one further, and I'll wear Vincent Sterrett's underwear this year, so it'll be a little celebration.
Yeah, I know you've got the paperback edition of Vincent Sterrett's underwear, but I've got the first edition with the dust jacket.
Oh, boy. Well, speaking of the weekend in January, we do have news about the BSI weekend. It is coming up. It is the first week of January of 2019. I believe it's the first week. Let me just make sure I'm putting my dates out there correctly, because the last thing we want to do is have people make reservations and then show up when the weekend is already passed. It's actually happening from January 9th through the 13th, 2019. So it really goes into the second week. We will be updating.
And you will be updating the website, no doubt.
The BSI weekend website and the BakerStreetIrregulars.com website. They will be updated right around November 21st or so. So look for those and figure out what you want to go to and where you want to stay. There are Lots of different options there, and the entire weekend, with the exception of the BSI dinner, is open to the public. So it's a great way to meet other Sherlockians and see what this hobby is really all about. Well, you know what else is happening here around I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere? That is Canonical Couplets. Yes, that sound means it's time once again to dig into the bag and see who we've got for entrance for last episode's Canonical Couplet. Now, if you don't recall, the hint was the killer was a big, good-hearted dunce, as beeswing in the bottle showed at once. You have any idea which story that referred to, Bert?
Yes, that is the great case, the first one in the Strand, called The Bottle in Bohemia, wasn't
it? You're warm. Although not at all. No. That is the Abbey Grange. No, Abbey Grange. Abbey Grange. And someone wrote in and said, why are you referring to Captain Crocker as a dunce? I guess I could defend it this way. He was certainly clever, but not clever enough to outsmart Sherlock Holmes, because he certainly forgot to pour the wine into all three glasses to make it look like it was a robbery, and he also cut the cord in the wrong place with his knife, so it was not at a natural breaking point where you might expect the bell pull to come down if someone yanked on it too hard. So hence dunce, and it rhymes with once.
Yes, which is not inconsiderable feature of the couplet, which we just read, by the way. We don't write them.
Well, we do have a winner. We had a number of entrants, and we are here to pick out a winner. So let's spin the big prize wheel once again as it goes around and around, slowing down and eventually stopping at number 11. And 11, let's look that up. That corresponds to Olivia Kirkendall. Olivia, congratulations. We will let you know via email that you won, but we will look for your address so we can send you something snazzy out of the vaults here at I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. And now we need to put ourselves into the next canonical couplet, and here is your clue. The best three-quarter Richmond ever had, no laurels gained as husband or dad. If you think you know the answer to which story this couplet refers to, put it in an email addressed to comment at ihearofsherlock.com. Put Canonical Couplets in the subject line and have at it. Good luck.
Very good. And how nice to have beeswing in last week's canonical couplet, and to refer to Albertus Magnus College earlier, and the adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes, all of which gives us, a nice recognition of the beautiful and talented Susan Rice.
Indeed. Lots of beautiful and talented Sherlockian women in our midst. It's quite intimidating at times.
Yes, and some beautiful and talented men, but then...
Yes.
My blushes, Watson.
My blushes all around. Well, it's nice to be around smart, talented, and good-looking people. But enough about you and I, Bert. Let's... we have a number of fantastic shows lined up in the coming weeks ahead. Of course, we are quickly getting into the holidays, and then before you know it, it'll be time for that BSI weekend. We hope to see you in New York, so let us know if you're going to be there, and let's make a time to say hi to each other at one of the events or another. And until things get all crazy and harried and fraught, I guess the word is, during the holidays, I am Scott Monty.
And I'm the frazzled Bert Wolder.
The game's afoot!
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance. which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.